I am Tiffany Muller, the president of In Citizens United and Let America Vote Action Fund. And it is such a pleasure to be here with you today and with such a distinguished panel. So we are going to be talking today about how we can fix our democracy. And we have with us Congresswoman Susan Wilde, Senator Bob Casey, Julianne Lieberman, and Khalifa Ali. And we're going to be moderating a really good question and answer session as well. But before we get started, let me just kick it off a little bit. You know, we are in a critical moment in our country, a moment where we have the choice about whether to continue to see our democracy be attacked and be torn down and have misinformation and disinformation spread about our elections, or an opportunity to strengthen our democracy, to restore public faith in our elections. And that starts with passing the For the People Act, which has been designated as Hr1 in the House and S1 in the Senate, signifying their importance. Because we know that if we want to be able to get anything else done, we first have to restore faith and trust in our government and who it's working for, and that it can work for the people and not just the special interests. And so by protecting the right to vote, ending the dominance of money in politics, restoring ethics and accountability, we can create that democracy that our founders envisioned, one that's of, by, and for the people. And we have such amazing champions with us on this call today, and it's my pleasure to kick this off by turning it over to Congresswoman Susan Wilde, who we have had the privilege of working with for the past 4 years and is a huge champion on this issue. Hr1 would not be Hr1 without her leadership. So, Congresswoman Wilde, I kick it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I really appreciate those comments. And I do consider Hr1 and In Citizens United to be top priorities for me, and it should be for all of us. It's really my pleasure and my honor to be here today with ECU and with Senator Casey for this very important conversation. And the work that's being done in this area is often not recognized by the public and yet is so incredibly important. So part of what I've made it my mission to do this year, before we get into an election year, is to really talk to people and educate people about what Hr1 is, what Citizens United was and is, and why the mission of ECU is so important. Let me just start by saying that more than 2 years ago, the House of Representatives passed the most comprehensive package of anti-corruption reforms since the Watergate corruption scandal. Think about that. I was in college when Watergate happened, just starting college, and that was many, many moons ago. And we haven't had this comprehensive package of reforms since then. So the legislation would sever the ties between special interests and politicians. It would protect the right to vote, which is so important, and it would ensure that public officials are working in the public interest. For far too long, special interests have controlled Washington and stood in the way of passing bills that are in the interest of all Americans, not just those who have the most money to buy access. And I've seen it firsthand. I haven't been in Congress all that long. I'm entering my 3rd year, but I will tell you that I've already seen the influence of big money and dark money. If we're going to make any progress on any issue in Washington, we have to change the system, which rewards moneyed interests at the expense of the American people. Whether it's drug prices, climate change, gun violence, the dominance of big money in our political system is skewing our democracy and hurting our people. It's time that a Pennsylvanian struggling to fill their insulin prescription has the same sway as the CEO of a prescription drug company. But for more than 2 years, Mitch McConnell, as majority leader in the Senate, has prioritized protecting corporate special interests over the voices of the American people, and he blocked Hr1 from a vote in the Senate when we passed it in the House. And it isn't just Hr1, but hundreds of bills that Democrats and Republicans supported. Bills that would lower the cost of prescription drugs, protect our air and water, reduce gun violence, create a fair economy, increase paychecks, deliver necessary COVID relief, and so much more. In the 117th Congress, we now finally have the opportunity to see H.R.1 and all of these bipartisan substantive pieces of good legislation be brought to a vote in the Senate. I just want to digress for a moment and say there is no time like now to make sure that we pass H.R.1. We may not have this opportunity again if we don't seize it now. And people just really cannot understand how fragile our democracy is, and also how fragile our majority both in the House and the Senate are. So now is the time to make sure that this happens. We made democracy a priority in the House 2 years ago. Now with the reintroduction of H.R.1 and its expected vote on the House floor at the beginning of March, we have the opportunity to end corruption and the power of special interests in Washington, and in so doing, to restore a level playing field in our democracy and an ability to make meaningful progress on the issues our constituents elected us to tackle. So I thank you and everyone for this discussion. With that, I would like to turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, as well as the senior senator from my state, Pennsylvania, Senator Bob Casey, who has been a long-standing advocate in the fight to finally end the dominance of big money in politics and also to protect the fundamental right to vote. So with that, Senator Casey, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Well, Susan, thank you very much. I want to thank you and thank everyone on this call. I want to especially note and commend the work of United States Representative Wilde on these issues. It has never been more important. I think we've seen in the last few years how destructive Citizens United, that Supreme Court case, has been not only on our elections but on our society. And in the roughly 10 years since that decision was decided, our country is headed in the wrong direction when it comes to the impediments to voting, not just the influence of, but the dominance, the awful dominance of big money in politics has headed our country in the wrong direction. And when I consider what we just went through this year, a major presidential election with an all-time record turnout, now is the time to work with the End Citizens United as an organization and other organizations to finally make progress on a whole range of issues relating to voting, relating to our democracy. And I want to commend the work of End Citizens United and other organizations. I guess also for today's purposes, the Let America Vote Action Fund, for the work that you're doing. That's why the For the People Act is so essential. And as the Congresswoman just noted, part of that is making sure that we can break through the stranglehold in the United States Senate, where legislation like this not only has not been passed because of the grip of the power of the Senate majority until most recently, but also not even debated, not even a full debate about our democracy, about voting, about access to voting. So the legislation that we're here to talk about has never been more important, whether it's relating to the provisions in the Act that focus on clean and fair elections, or the provisions that relate to ending the influence of big money in politics, or ensuring that public servants are in fact serving the public interest and not some special interest or some private interest or corporate interest. So it's never been more important. I think we set a good example in Pennsylvania by passing Act 77. Governor Wolf signed into law in 2019 in a way that was prescient in light of what happened after 2019 with the pandemic, allowing Pennsylvania voters to vote really for the first time in a really substantial way, to vote by mail, to end or to amplify, I should say, no excuse absentee voting. So a record turnout of more than 70% also meant that more than a third, about 38% of our votes in Pennsylvania in the presidential election were vote by mail. That was the right thing to do. It's especially significant in light of the year that we just endured. So we have to get the For the People Act passed. We also, I hope, would further expand voting across the board by passing the Accessible Voting Act, something that I have worked on in the Senate with Senator Klobuchar. Here's just some of the provisions of that. First, it would establish the Office of Accessibility within the Election Assistance Commission to support and oversee state efforts to expand voter accessibility. Second, it would establish a state grant program for the Office of Accessibility to administer for the improvement of accessibility when registering to vote or voting by absentee ballot or casting a ballot in person. It would also provide up-to-date voting information and resources through accessible websites. It would also expand the number of options to cast a ballot in federal elections, just to name a few of the provisions. So all of this is essential for us to move forward as a nation to make sure, as the Congresswoman indicated, that everyone has an equal voice. And for too long, and especially since Citizens United, it's as if we talk about the public square, but there are some people in the public square who have a much louder megaphone, and they're cloaked in darkness with all the dark money that is spent by individuals or corporate entities, so that they get the biggest microphone, but we can't find out who the hell they are, and provide a measure of scrutiny that should be applied to voices, big voices in politics. We've got to end that. We've got to tear that cloak off them and make sure that that microphone is as loud for any individual voter as it is for a corporate voice or a voice of a special interest. So we got to make sure that we fulfill the promise of America, which is free and fair elections and equal access and an equal voice in our democracy. So I'm grateful for this opportunity and look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Casey. Thank you so much, Congresswoman Wilde. We are all so very grateful for your leadership on these issues and for bringing attention to the problems that our democracy is facing day in and day out, and the solutions that we have right now, right at our fingertips, and a once-in-a-generation opportunity to pass. And, you know, we are talking about the For the People Act, and really quickly so that everyone watching knows, it does four basic simple things. First, it makes it easier, not harder to vote. And you just heard Senator Casey talking about the importance of that. And what we've seen since November 2020 with the largest turnout in U.S. history is 165 bills being introduced in 33 states across the country, including right there in Pennsylvania, to further restrict the right to vote, to keep folks from being able to go to the ballot box. So Hr1 makes it easier, not harder to vote, and would actually override many of those state bills that we are seeing. Number two, it ends the dominance of big money in politics. The 2020 election was $14.5 billion, billion with a B. That's more than double the previous most expensive election cycle before that. So we have to break that tie between money and public policy, because as the senator said and as the Congresswoman said, we can't get everything else done, from lowering prescription drug prices to gun background checks to addressing climate change, if we don't break that tie. Number three, it makes sure that we have fair maps and fair redistricting and gets rid of the gerrymandering that we have seen. And we're heading into a redistricting year. So this is really, really important. And number four, it says, if you're going to be a public official, then you have to serve the public good, not your own private good. And so it puts in new ethics and accountability standards and works to clean up corruption. And does common sense things, like says, if you're going to be president, you have to release your tax forms. And you can't serve on for-profit corporate boards if you're in the Congress. You know, common sense things like that. This bill would really revolutionize and transform our country and about who gets to have power in our country. But we need all of you watching. We need your help to get it over the finish line. And we need you helping speak out about why it's so important. And we are so grateful to have such amazing on-the-ground partners that we have on the call with us today. So first, I'm going to turn it over to Khalifa Ali, who's the Executive Director of Common Cause Pennsylvania. Common Cause has been on the forefront of these issues since their founding in 1970, and they've been a leader in building a better democracy for residents of Pennsylvania and all of America. And before joining Common Cause, Khalifa led the 2020 Pennsylvania voter engagement campaign for the National Urban League. So, Khalifa, I turn it over to you for opening remarks. It's such a joy to have you on this call today. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Tiffany. I appreciate that. Thank you to End Citizens United, Let America Vote for organizing this event. And a big thanks to Senator Casey and Congresswoman Wilde for their continued support of the For the People Act. Right now, as Tiffany alluded, we are a divided country, but there are some things that bring us together, such as our abiding belief that democracy is the government of the people, for the people. The reforms in the For the People Act are supported by more than 2/3 of American voters. These are tried and true reforms. Many have passed at the state and local level in red, blue, and purple states, often with strong bipartisan support. For instance, as Senator Casey alluded to, more than 2.6 million of Pennsylvania voters embraced vote by mail in November, after Act 77 was passed by a Republican legislature and signed by our Democratic governor the previous year. 33 other states have no excuse absentee voting or vote by mail. Connecticut has had a small donor campaign financing system since 2005. The bill was signed by a Republican governor, and since then, about 3/4 of state legislative candidates have used the system. 13 other states now have some type of alternative to traditional campaign financing by private donors. More than 2/3 of America's voters are opposed to gerrymandering, which Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled unconstitutional a few years ago. At least 16 states now use redistricting commissions rather than the state legislature to draw district lines. These and other state-tested reforms have been combined into the For the People Act, and it's time to pass the bill through Congress. Common Cause Pennsylvania and our 45,000 plus supporters will continue to do whatever we can to get the For the People Act passed and signed into law by President Biden. The past few months have seen a lot of unsubstantiated allegations related to the outcomes of the elections. Some of these claims are now being used as excuses to undermine Act 77 and create barriers to our freedom to vote. Passing the For the People Act through Congress is the way we can protect the rights to vote for everyone. It will help ensure that every American citizen, regardless of where they live or who they vote for, has equal access to the ballot box. And it will help ensure that our elected officials are representing the voters, not partisan or special interests. That's just how American democracy is supposed to work. We must and will build a democracy that works for the people, where every person has equal access to the ballot box and fair representation. We look forward to working with Senator Casey, Congresswoman Wilde, our coalition partners to pass the For the People Act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khalifa. And now I'm going to introduce and turn it over to Julianne Lieberman, who is the Assistive Technology Program Coordinator at Pennsylvania's Initiative on Assistive Technology, Simple Institute on Disabilities. And for over 25 years, she has been training companies about the need to provide assistive technology for the blind and low vision customers. So Julianne, I turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you. It's a real privilege to be in such esteemed company here today. And I actually wear several hats, as I like to say. Not only am I an employee of the Institute on Disabilities, but I also am a representative from the Pennsylvania Council of the Blind, which is the state affiliate of the American Council of Blind. I'm a lifelong Pennsylvania resident. Yes, I actually was born in Pennsylvania and I've been voting here since 1976. I've been voting in my current precinct for 38 years on a regular basis. And I really wanted to bring forth some of the considerations when we were talking about accessible voting and Senator Casey's interest in particular for the Accessible Voting Act. As a person who has voted for so many years, as a person with a disability, I am blind, by the way, and I have some vision, but not too much. And prior to the Help America Vote Act, I would bring along, as soon as my kids could read, they came with me, and then it was part of the way to educate them into the voting process as well. And they would assist me by reading the ballot and scribing for me upon my request. And they were all told as they left the ballot box or ballot area that it was my right to a private and independent ballot, and that they not to tell anyone who I voted for. Because, I can tell somebody, but it was not their privilege to do so. And they respected that. And I'm very proud to say that all three of my children do vote regularly, including one by mail right now. And so it's been a very important lesson that I passed on. And the bottom line, as I always told them, is, you have no right to complain if you're not part of the process. And your process is very important at the ballot box. So make sure that you can use that right to vote in a very effective way. So as a person with a disability, I've had a history of varying experiences. Now, I did mention how I used to have assistance. At one time, however, I think my son was probably in high school when he accompanied me, and one of the poll workers says, "Oh, no, he can't go in there with you." And I said, "But I can't read the ballot." So that was before the machines were available. And then they said, "We have to have a poll worker." I said, No. I can choose the person who comes in with me. And that's the point, I think, in the message when we're talking about accessible voting, is having the options, having a choice, which way works best for that individual in order for them to successfully and independently cast their vote. And so it's very important to me that we consider this as part of the legislation. Then, now that there is accessible voting machines, I can honestly tell you that in every election, I am the only one in my precinct that uses that. Now, it bothers me that I am the only person who uses that for two reasons. First off, the first reason is awareness, that people that might need that type of support either choose not to vote or choose to vote in other means that maybe they're less comfortable with. Maybe they would have an opportunity to independently vote at the polling precinct. It would be a great idea for them to. So ignorance is one thing. So people don't know that this is available to them. Secondly, I also had an experience in the primary in 2019 where a new poll worker was, when I came in and I said that I used the electronic voting machine, and she said, "Oh no, we're told not to have people use that." And I said, "Well, really?" And she said, "Yeah, in our polling training, as poll worker, we were told to discourage people from using it." Well, she said it to the wrong person. And I said, "No, well, we'll have a discussion with that in Westchester." And I told them that I was with Pennsylvania Council of the Blind and that I had every right to use that equipment. And of course, they acquiesced after they dusted it off and figured out how to turn it on. That was an experience that I hadn't forgotten. And that's recent. That's only, it'd be 3 years now. That shouldn't be the case. We all should have an independent opportunity to vote in whatever way works for them. I did contact my colleagues at the Pennsylvania Council of Blind once I got the invitation to join you today, to ask them to send me their input. What was their experience in November in the election? And as we know, this is an extraordinary situation with obviously fears of the pandemic. So many people opted either to do an absentee ballot, the traditional absentee ballot, paper ballot sent, or have a ballot that was provided to them electronically and then printed at their own location and placed in the two secure envelopes and sent. The experiences or that feedback I got was there are still polling locations that do not know how to use these machines, do not know how to turn them on, and they make it very difficult for somebody who needs, because they have a print disability, whether it be vision loss or dyslexia, other type of categories in print disability, that really would benefit from using that machine. And also, it is also physically easier for people with some motor control issues to press a button rather than to fill in a circle on a page. They don't have, you have kind of tremors or whatever kind of physical limitation they might have. That's a real challenge for them to fill in those little, dots in there. It's much easier for them to push a button. So the electronic systems that are now currently available in Pennsylvania could help, mediate that issue and encourage more people to vote that might choose not to or feel afraid to do so because they have a physical disability or a sensory disability. So, that's one of the things I think is one of the issues. And another thing is the education for the poll workers on how to use this equipment, what it's meant to do, and also how best to work with the individual that comes in. Fortunately, I said I voted in the same precinct for 38 years, so we have some veteran poll workers there that know me and know that that's my need. So when I came in, even though one poll worker in November was like really flustered by it, the lead poll worker said, "Oh no, it's okay. Julianne uses this equipment all the time." And again, it was that poll worker was aware of it, but many of them aren't. And so just little common sense things of pointing, it's over there, doesn't help me. Fortunately, I did have my son accompany me, one of my sons accompany me, just for that kind of purpose, given that it would be a rather tense situation voting this year with the crowds. I am happy to say that this year I was pleasantly surprised that the accessible machine was also at, I say, wheelchair height, as opposed to the standing model that was there before. That would be a difficult situation for somebody who, again, has mobility challenges, so they can't stand to vote, and hold on to a walker, or they can't sit in a wheelchair and reach up that high to vote. So I thought that was a real sensitivity thing that they actually recognized that was an issue. And it was fine for me. I sat down and voted, which was a very, nice situation for me as well. So all things considered, there's some progress, but there's still a lot of work to be obviously still held. The issue about the mail-in ballots, what came back to me, some of them still ask a family member or someone they're comfortable with to complete the ballot for them and put it in the envelope, and then they were directed where to sign, and that went off. And that's one choice. I prefer to have an independent, I don't have to rely on somebody else to do that for me. But then there are people that had the ones that as I mentioned, that did have it emailed them to them, and then they completed the ballot and printed it off. And the difficulty they had with that was not just the confusion of the envelopes, and I understand that was across the board in many of the states as well, how these envelopes and the ballots themselves were handled. But one of the issues and something that we don't think about, generally speaking, is they were asked to sign the envelope and date it. And there was no indication that they could tell where to sign it. So that was a challenge to making sure their signature would be valid in the right location and dated properly. In fact, one report came back as they called in to their Board of Elections to find out if the ballot was received, and said, is it a problem? Because they understand that the signature went on top of the date because they couldn't see it. So little things like making that envelope easier to determine where to sign and where the date belongs is something that's a minor thing that could perhaps make a big difference for people to complete their process either way, and whether they have it mailed to them in print or whether they print it off. And that's some observations on that.
Julianne, that seems like a great, I want to make sure to segue because what you just said reminded me of Senator Casey. You, I know, have the Accessible Voting Act, and I think a lot of, Julianne, what you were talking about, Senator Casey, your legislation also works to address, and we'll just jump right into Q&A to keep everything moving. Senator Casey, can you talk about how your bill would address some of the concerns that Julianne was just talking about, and about why it's so important we get that piece signed into law?
Yeah, I think Julianne was able to give personal testimony based upon our experience, not just as a voter, but as a voter who never misses a vote. But even today, there are so many issues that stand in the way of folks voting, as we've discussed. And the foundation for the Accessible Voting Act is to make sure that folks that have a disability, for example, can exercise their right to vote, and that means making sure that voting is accessible. We know that just historically, just not even 20 years ago, back in 2002, the Congress did pass legislation that spoke to some of these issues, the so-called Help America Vote Act, known often by the acronym HAVA, and that legislation required that jurisdictions responsible for conducting federal elections to provide at least one accessible voting system for people with disabilities at each polling place in federal elections. So part of the challenge is making sure that we have compliance with that prior federal statute. But in addition to that, we have to do more because of what has arisen over a number of years. We're told by the General Accountability Office, for example, that if you combine the architectural deficiencies at polling places along with the voting booth access deficiencies, when you combine the two, that means that as of 2016, this is the most recent number that the GAO studied, but as of 2016, only 17% of polling places nationally would be considered fully accessible. 17%. Now, if we were able to magically update that for 2020, which we can't do, I'm sure that number might be a little better, but probably not a heck of a lot better. So that's why I've introduced with Senator Klobuchar, and we've reintroduced the bill this year to speak to some of those issues that several of us have highlighted today, including most especially Julianne, by establishing an Office of Accessibility within the Election Assistance Commission to support and oversee state efforts to expand accessibility. We also have a grant program in the legislation. We also want to make sure that we're providing more up-to-date voting information and resources, and of course to expand the number of options to cast a ballot. So part of this is to make sure that we're enforcing the law as it currently stands, but also to expand those opportunities that we can put in place so that everyone has equal access to voting.
Thank you so much, Senator, and thank you so much, Julianne. Congresswoman, I'm going to come to you next, which is, and you talked about this some in your opening, but, you know, you've now been in Congress for going on 3 years. Can you talk a little bit about why we have to pass Hr1, why it's so critical to protecting our democracy, and kind of the threats that you see to our democracy right now?
Well, Tiffany, you mentioned the 4 cornerstones of Hr1, and the one that really stands out for me is ending gerrymandering. As you mentioned, we're going into a redistricting year. For anybody who's watching, having just completed the census every 10 years, we have redistricting as it happened in Pennsylvania. We had it in early 2018 as well, but that's a different story. And when we look at how districts are drawn in gerrymandered areas, which is pretty much all of the United States, they lend themselves to one party or the other being assured of winning a seat, and over and over and over again. So that's why you've got some members of Congress who are able to stay in their seats for 30, 50, 40 years. And what that means in many cases is that there's no accountability because they're virtually guaranteed of re-election. I don't happen to be in one of those districts. My district is actually, because of the redistricting in early 2018 in Pennsylvania, my district happens to be evenly split almost between Democrats and Republicans. But as we enter this period of redistricting, we're facing the possibility that the Republican majority Pennsylvania legislature will draw the line such that my district is made considerably more red, other districts are as well, and thereby increase their majority in the Pennsylvania delegation. And this is just one state we're talking about. So I think, and when I was talking about the importance of now, of it happening now, as I said, we've got a slim majority in Congress, an even slimmer majority in the U.S. Senate, and we, of course, have the White House. So we have the opportunity to pass Hr1, a unique, unprecedented opportunity to pass it. But if we go to the next election cycle, after redistricting has occurred, and gerrymandered districts may look even worse than they already do, the chance of passing Hr1 will probably evaporate. And that's just the blunt, honest truth. So I believe this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to get this through. There's a reason Mitch McConnell did not take up Hr1 in the last Congress after we passed it overwhelmingly in the House, and that's because he likes those gerrymandered districts, right, in addition to many other things that Hr1 would get rid of. And so I truly believe that there is nothing more important for us to work on right now than this. And I know that we've got a lot of competing priorities. The good news is we're very good multitaskers, and there are a whole lot of us who can work along parallel tracks. But this literally has to get through in the 117th Congress.
I could not agree more. And I believe we're capable of doing multiple things at the same time. We can get people the help that they need, and we can strengthen our democracy and make sure we're protecting it for decades to come. So thank you so much, Congresswoman. Khalifa, I'm going to come to you next. Pennsylvania was at the heart of many voting concerns that we saw in the last election, and voters faced a lot of confusion about the voting process, some due to the pandemic, as well as intentional efforts to make it harder to vote. So can you talk about how this bill would help address those problems and what you're seeing in Pennsylvania on the ground right now?
So first, it's our belief that, that democracy is a political system that really requires participation from its citizens. And in order for that maximum participation to occur, you want to do two things. You want to remove barriers to people actively participating in the process, and you want to reinstill confidence in a system that works as long as we together, sort of walk through things, talk through things, and participate actively. In terms of Hr1, it's a huge bill in terms of reinstilling confidence. Based on conversations we've had, there's a bit of waning confidence in our democracy. And what we need to do is we have to reinstill confidence so that we can encourage participation. And Act 77 increased unparalleled levels of participation in the presidential election. Hr1 would not only reinforce those, but sort of codify them and make them federal law in a way that we believe would help increase that confidence that is waning now, specifically in the state of Pennsylvania. So we need that reinstilled confidence in the system in order for us to constantly re-engage and encourage people to participate in this process and continue to talk through a lot of the concerns that we're seeing in today's society.
Thank you so much, Khalifa. Senator, oftentimes when we're talking about voting rights, we talk about access to the voting booth, we talk about mail-in ballots, but it's also really important that we have access to accurate, up-to-date voting information online. Can you talk to us about making sure that that information is accurate and accessible and how important that is and why that's important?
Yeah, there's just no question that every one of us in one way or another, is more heavily reliant upon online information. So the internet becomes a vehicle through which we get information about so many aspects of our lives, including voting. But it's also important for getting information on driving and what you have to comply with for DMV, or information about all other parts of our lives. But we have to make sure that even as we're getting information through that means, that we've got to make sure that information is available to everyone by every means possible. So states need to take the time to make sure that all information on their websites, including links or attachments, can be read by accessible technology. And that's why folks who might have a disability can miss information, because states don't often take that extra step to provide that information that's accessible in every form possible. So they need to make sure that plain language alternative descriptions are available. And we know that the ability to cast a vote doesn't mean a heck of a lot if an individual is unable to find out where to cast a ballot or how to apply for and return a mail-in ballot. So we've got to make sure that even as we're focused on the broader reforms of the legislation, that we're also taking these individual steps forward on providing accurate and accessible information. And for a lot of folks, that means taking that extra step to make sure that we have information that can be read by accessible technology. So we've got a long way to go. But as I just want to make one final reference to what Congresswoman Wilde was referring to, and Khalifa and Julianne were making reference to. We have an opportunity in the next year or two, and it's a little less than 2 years now, that we may not have for a long, long time, with a Democratic president and with Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate. It's just a reality that we're making these issues a bigger priority than Republicans in Congress are. But it is not possible to get done what we need to get done without working on getting bipartisan support. So I'd urge all of us to continue to focus on making sure that Republican voters, Republican public officials know what's at stake here. And I would hope that any Republican elected official would also want to pass this legislation. For the people is really about all of us. It's about whether or not we want to have fair elections. I would hope that if you're a candidate for federal office, you would want a fair election to transpire when you're a candidate for a federal office. I would hope that you would want to lessen, not increase the influence of big money or big corporate voices in politics. Because I think some of my Republican colleagues in the Senate are starting to realize that a system that maybe for a large portion of the last decade favored their side might actually be changing, and might actually be changing to their detriment. It's not good for anyone if big money can stay involved in politics and can be shielded from scrutiny and public disclosure and the kind of review that voters should have the opportunity to apply before they vote. When you're watching, for example, television advertising paid for by dark money, interests that don't get a lot of disclosure or scrutiny, why would you want to continue that? Why would you want your voters, whether they're Democratic voters, independent voters, or Republican voters, why would you want them to have less information about an organization that might be attacking you as a Republican candidate for public office? Why would you want less information about that entity as opposed to more information? So even as we're pressing the important elements of this legislation, we've got to make the case to voters of all kinds and to public officials of all kinds that this legislation is in the interests of all of us. This legislation won't necessarily favor one party over the other. It'll help all of us to have freer, fairer elections. And just wanted to make that point because I think it's sometimes lost on some of the discussion about how important this is.
Well, thank you, Senator. And I couldn't agree more. And I think that for everyone watching, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but it means to get this done and to reach out to all of your representatives and your senators. We need your voices too. So please go to incitizensunited.org and you can send emails to your representatives and your senators. You can call them. They need to hear from you. You can go to commoncause.org and sign up. We're all working with our members across the country, but what is most important is to make sure your voice is being heard about how important this legislation is, because that's the only way we're going to get it done. We have to put enough public pressure on that everyone recognizes how important this is, because we have great champions on here with us today, absolutely. But we got to make sure we turn every single member of Congress into a great champion for our democracy. Julianne, what's the one change that you think would have the greatest impact to extend voter accessibility to people with disabilities?
Education. And I mean education not just for the poll workers, but also education for the public, to allow them to have the potential of using any kind of accessibility option that they require in order to do the vote. So that's obviously high in my priority, but also, gone to the same idea that, if we don't address these changes now, when we've had the greatest participation by voters, we're losing an opportunity. It's time to engage us as Americans in order to keep the process fair and equal to anyone, all Americans.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I could not agree more. We have more people engaged right now than we've ever had, and we must keep them engaged and keep educating them. Congresswoman Wilde, I'm going to come back over to you for a minute. We've seen this rise in people giving small contributions to Democratic and Republican candidates, people who give $5, $10, even $1, because they really believe in the candidates and they believe in the movement. And you have been the recipient of those contributions in your election. Can you talk about what those contributions mean to you as a candidate and how the small dollar donor matching program in Hr1 would encourage more people to have a voice in our political system?
I'd love to. This is one of my favorite parts of Hr1. Small dollar donations help the American people feel invested in our political system. And that is incredibly important. For one thing, the more people that are invested, the more will vote. And voting, as we all know, is one of our most sacred rights in this democracy. But there's far too many people in this country who believe that all politicians are bought and paid for. There is no elected official alive who hasn't read that, seen negative comments on their social media feeds, accusing all politicians of being bought and paid for. That, to me, is a devastating commentary on the state of our political system. Because if you believe the politicians are bought and paid for, then you really don't have any faith in our governmental process. And so when you create a system whereby the small dollar donor matching program that's envisioned by Hr1 becomes a reality, then number one, it's really helpful to candidates like me who do not take corporate PAC money. Many candidates on both sides of the aisle do take corporate PAC money. It means that those of us who don't are not on a level playing field, quite honestly. It means that we can't count on, for your average congressional race on any given cycle, there's at least $250,000 that we're leaving on the table by not taking corporate PAC money, and I'm just being really honest and blunt about it. So we're not on a level playing field, and my colleagues in the House who also don't take corporate PAC money are in the same situation. So first of all, it evens out that playing field, because it means that the power of those small dollar donors is multiplied with public matching funds. And so, somebody who contributes $25 or less to a campaign, first of all, and let me just digress for a moment and tell you, I actually get ActBlue notifications on my phone. I don't look at every single one of them, but I scroll through them periodically. And a big reason that I do is because if somebody who's one of my constituents contributes $5, that's really meaningful to me. It's as meaningful as a $500 contribution coming from somewhere else in the country. And because it means that person's invested in me and they are going to be voting for me in all likelihood. And it also means that if I run into that person and I happen to know them, I can thank them for their contribution. So I can't really overstate how important these small dollar donations are. But the impact of them is not nearly as great financially as a large contribution from a corporate PAC. And by that, I just mean you can't buy as much with it, which is a shame. Unfortunately, political campaigns cost far too much. It's something I would really like to see us bring an end to. The number of problems that we could solve with the amount of money that go into elections is really problematic. So the number one thing that I would like people to understand, though, is that this program is not paid for with taxpayer dollars. I will tell you, in the last election cycle this past year, one of the biggest hits against me by my Republican opponent was that I allegedly wanted to use taxpayer dollars to pay for my campaign and for my personal expenses. This was a veiled reference to a terribly distorted description of Hr1. The program is completely funded through a new surcharge that would be enacted as a result of Hr1 on corporate lawbreakers and wealthy tax cheats. So think for a second about sanctions that are imposed on BP Oil following the oil spill, or Facebook, or any number of Goldman Sachs, any number of large corporations who run afoul of the law, who have financial penalties imposed on them, or wealthy tax cheats, as I mentioned. Those people who break the public trust will bear the cost of helping to create a more equitable and inclusive democracy. So it's not taxpayer dollars. I'm not looking to dive into anybody's pocket to fund my campaign. I have no interest in doing that. But I think a program whereby we divert some of the money that comes about as a result of these punitive sanctions on lawbreakers, that a really worthwhile way of spending that money, in part, would be to create this more equitable democracy. And so the new small dollar donor matching program would strengthen the political power of everyday hardworking Americans by amplifying their political donations. That $5 contribution becomes a $10 contribution, and so on. So through this innovative system, we can finally establish a 21st century system of citizen-owned election and put to bed this concept that politicians are bought and paid for by corporate interests.
Thank you. That was a great description. And, the only other piece I would add to what you said was, I also love that it opens the door for candidates who otherwise wouldn't be able to run for office. Mm-hmm. That it is that it hugely uplifts women candidates of color, folks from working class backgrounds, that, it is hard to run for office, and we want our democracy to be as representative of America as possible, and this helps get us closer to that. So thank you so much, Congresswoman. We are starting to run out of time. I have one final question, and then I have a question for all of you as the wrap up. So, Khalifa, one final question. You previously served on the ethics board for the city of Pittsburgh, so you and Congresswoman Wilde, who serves on the House Ethics Committee, really understand the importance of preserving the public trust. Are there any additional pieces of HR1 that you want to make sure to highlight that we haven't already talked about? You're muted.
So actually, it goes back to something Joanne mentioned, which is poll worker training, which I think is absolutely essential part of HR1. As a voter and going to the polls and asking questions around, submitting a voter your mail-in ballot or getting a mail-in ballot that you never received initially, and experiencing some confusion, around exactly what the process was something that was concerning for me. I didn't put any blame on the actual poll worker, but to see the confusion and to know that can be discouraging for some people with regard to voting or participating in an expanded portion of voting is something that I think is absolutely necessary. And on the other side of that, absolute transparency with regard to campaign financing is an essential part of HR1 as well. And it would be, we're the Commonwealth is a little lax on that, and it would be definitely helpful to see more transparency in that area, and HR1 will provide that. And we're super excited about the possibilities related to that.
Thank you so much, Khalifa. And, this has been just an incredible conversation. I feel so very privileged to have been able to share this past hour with all of you and to talk about the importance of passing the For the People Act. Okay, this is going to be our final wrap-up question, and I'm going to go in reverse order from how we started earlier today. But for everyone who's watching and for everyone who will watch this later, can you give them your piece of advice on what they can do today to help us reform our democracy and strengthen our democracy? So, Julian, I'm going to start with you. Khalifa, I'm coming to you next, then Congresswoman, then Senator.
As part of an advocacy group in Pennsylvania, one thing we always recommend to those that join us is that your voice matters, and that if you make contact with your representative, your congresswoman or congressperson and your senator, let them know your stand, educate yourself, learn what's at stake, and then express yourselves. So every voice matters. I heard a statistic years ago saying that if 5 people bring the attention to a person in government, it gets a red flag. So all it takes is even just 5 people making it notice. So can you imagine if you amplify that by 10 times, 50 people bringing that to the office of our representatives? I think that is one word of advice I'd give. Speak up. Let people know they are working for us on our behalf. They need to know what our opinions are and how their decisions affect us on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you so much, Julianne, and thank you so much for joining us today and for all the work that you do every day. Khalifa?
So I'm going to follow Joanne's example and say that so we're all advocates. We're all essentially advocates. I think we sell ourselves short in terms of our ability to advocate for the issues that matter to us. So one of the things that I typically notice is that a lot of the people that we see participating in these events are pretty much the same faces when we go around the state. They're the same faces that we tend to see. That's important. This is the first step. But the next step is about being an advocate, not starting with your elected official, but starting inside your house and then advocating outside of your house. How many people do you talk to on a regular basis about the issues that matter to you in your neighborhood? There are a lot of people who would be very interested in hearing your perspective or hearing about an issue that they may know nothing about. Many people might not know about HR1. How do we get that information out to them? What's the best process for that? And that starts with you having these conversations outside of these forums with your neighbors, with your congregations, with your friends, with your enemies. These are all conversations we need to have with one another. And then what we see is we begin to build a critical mass of individuals who can then act and move on these issues with a partnership with our elected officials. But we have to have our conversations first with each other. We got to start with us, and then we go out from there. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share and to learn.
Thank you so much, Khalif. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all of your leadership with Common Cause Pennsylvania. And we are so happy to work with you on all of these issues. Congresswoman Wilde, your turn.
Well, let me first assure the viewers I'm not here as a plant. I'm really not. But your question prompted me to go take a look at the ECU website and Citizens United website. And I strongly encourage everybody who's interested in this topic and wants to support this mission to look at the End Citizens United website. Just Google it and it'll come right up. There are a number of actions that you can take. First of all, let me just encourage you to support candidates who have taken the ECU pledge. And secondly, I want you to all reach out and ask, demand the candidates that are talking to you, people who are running for office in your area, people who appear on candidate platforms, ask them the tough questions about whether they will support something like HR1, democracy reform. Ask them what they would, and of course, maybe by the time those candidates appear, we'll have passed HR1. I can be optimistic. But if not, I want you to go to the webpage, and there are a number of action items. You can sign a pledge. And by the way, everybody, this is not a partisan thing. This is absolutely not a partisan exercise. Republican, Democrat, independent, or other, you can absolutely make these demands of elected officials and candidates. So please take the actions when you go to the website. There's a Take Action tab, and just go to it and demand that your candidates and that your elected officials are acting in a way that will bring about a better democracy. That's what you can do, and don't be shy about it. Don't be retiring about it. Just do it, and there's no better time than when people are running for office or running for re-election to make these demands.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. We'll take you as a plant any day. Thank you. And Senator, thank you so much for being with us. Want to hear your closing thoughts on what people can do to help us get this over the finish line.
Well, Tiffany, thanks, and I appreciate your leadership and your team at End Citizens United. I want to thank Congresswoman Wilde and Khalif and Julianne and so many others who were part of this discussion today, either directly or by way of participation by listening to the exchanges. But I don't think there's much I could add to the presentations made by the three leaders who preceded me. But I think most people know by now, if never before, certainly after this past election, they know the power that they have. One person, a small group of people, can come together in ways that were really impossible 10 or 20 years ago because of technology, because for all of the reasons we lament what social media can do to divide people in our society, all of the challenges that are posed by new technology, and especially on social media. It can also be a tool for reform, for change, and for aggregating voices to bring about that change. I guess I had asked folks and reiterate what Congresswoman Wilde said about challenging candidates to support what is not just HR1, but S1, Senate Bill number 1. Because when we talk about the For the People Act, we're talking about some of the most fundamental and far-reaching changes we've made in a generation, especially when it comes to voting and ethics and getting big money out of politics. So you should challenge candidates for the United States Senate, candidates for the House, and even candidates at different levels of government to at least be supportive of the elements of this legislation. And it's never been more critical right now. One moment that will be important is when the United States Senate considers this legislation. The first vote isn't a vote for or against the bill. The first vote will be, should we even debate the bill? In the Senate, they call that the cloture vote, kind of a threshold vote before the actual vote on the substantive legislation. I hope folks around the country would push members of the United States Senate in both parties, but there's one party that's less likely to move it forward, to push them to vote to, at a bare minimum, to debate this. And then, of course, to vote in favor of passing this legislation, because it's critically important that we have this in place as a matter of law so that we can have more participation in our democracy, more people voting, and in more ways to have accessible voting, as my bill speaks to. So there's a lot to do, but I think most people understand, maybe now more than ever, not only what is at stake, but the power they have to move this agenda forward. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. And this was a fantastic conversation, and really enjoyed it. So take care, stay safe, stay well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.